Welcome to the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of RocketPD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I really think technology is a lot like fire. Fire can be used poorly and it can be used to burn buildings down and it can harm people.
Matt Miller is a former Spanish teacher and the author of Ditch That Textbook and Tech Like a Pirate. In the age of fleeting student attention, Matt has coached thousands of educators in the art and science of technology as a tool for student learning.
But fire also warms our food and it keeps our house warm and it provides light and all of that. And so
in this episode of the RocketPD Podcast, I ask Matt what it takes to create authentic and engaging classroom experiences that capture students' attention and hold it. We talk about ways to include students in the instructional design process and why the technology you use is less important than the experiences that you create.
Whenever we're using technology in an effective way to, amplify and lift up the good teaching and learning that's already happening, I think that can be huge.
At the end, Matt talks about a cohort he's building later in the year to help teachers engage students through the power of technology. Stick around to learn more. Hey, Matt, great to have you. I know we're talking a lot today about student attention, and before we even got on the call, you and I were talking about this really interesting question, which is technology. Oftentimes we think of technology as something that is distracting. I was telling you a story about my daughter who's often trying to come to the dinner table and ask to look at my smartphone so she can watch videos while we're at the dinner table trying to have a conversation. I think sometimes we see that happening in schools, but then there's this other side of it that says technology used effectively can also be a great tool to engage students. So let's talk about sort of the fleeting idea of student attention in classrooms today and the challenges that teachers like yourself and others are up against.
Yeah. And, I think, what you just said is spot on, that we think of it a lot of times as technology is distracting. But really, I think distraction is just a byproduct of being pulled away from something that we're not motivated about or we're not excited about to something that we are. And so a lot of times, whatever's on that technology is probably providing students a little dopamine hit, whether it's a notification or a new video or a game that they want to play or something like that. And so a lot of times it manifests itself in that technology pulling our attention away from something else. And we see it all the time in the classroom, don't we? You saw it at the dinner table with your daughter. And,
right.
I've seen it in my own high school Spanish classes where I'll be teaching and I'll have everybody's attention. And then just a couple minutes later, there'll be a couple of kids that are like staring at the table, or staring at their leg or something. I'm like, you're not staring at your leg. You're looking at your phone. And I know why you're looking at your phone. It's because all of a sudden something has pulled you away from what I'm talking about. And really, this is an issue that we have grappled with in education for ages. Like, I like to think that even Socrates himself, all the way back doing some of those, original Socratic seminars, every once in a while had students whose eyes just kind of like drifted away, or their like attention sort of faded and then they pulled themselves back. And it really just has to do with this attention really has to do with motivation and focus and, that term engagement that we like to throw around in education so much. And so what I really think is that if we take a look at what engages students, if we get to know those students better, and if we figure out what engages them, what captures their attention, what's, motivating and important to them, and we start to align our stuff with it a little bit better, instead of just saying, this is what you have to learn, so you better learn it. Like, I think that can do wonders for attention and motivation.
That's really cool. So, and you've written a couple books about this, Ditch That Textbook, Tech Like a Pirate, this whole idea that technology used intentionally in the classroom can also be a powerful motivator for students. We talked about this idea of creating sort of a buzzworthy classroom. Can you talk a little bit about how technology, we talked about, could it be a distraction? Maybe, but then how when it's used effectively and intentionally by teachers, how it can be a powerful motivator for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I really think technology is a lot like fire. Fire can be used poorly and it can be used to burn buildings down and it can harm people. But fire also warms our food and it keeps our house warm and it provides light and all of that. And so, whenever we're using technology in an effective way to amplify and lift up the good teaching and learning that's already happening, I think that can be huge. And a lot of times you go into schools and, it might be a school that has one-to-one Chromebooks or one-to-one laptops or something. If some of the teachers that'll say, oh, you know what, those kids, all they ever do with that technology is they just play games on it. Well, that might be the case because they don't have a really good picture of how it can be used as an academic tool and how it can be really used to support learning. And a lot of times I think teachers just have a hard time of picturing how that is. And so once we start to see how it actually amplifies and lifts things up in the classroom, it can be huge and it can have a whole lot to do with attention. And I found in my own classes that sometimes if we take cues from the things that students really love, we can use that as a lens to look at when we're looking at that assignment or that student learning. So case in point. Let's say, for instance, that we're in a high school literature class and we're getting ready to read Romeo and Juliet. Well, we usually ask students to write down what it is that they've learned in a document or to fill out a worksheet or something like that. And if we're talking about attention, that's the kind of thing where that cell phone can pull their attention away pretty quickly because they have no motivation or desire. It's not connected to anything that they're exceptionally excited about. But I've always thought, well, what if we frame the learning through a different lens? What if we made that assignment look a little like, say, Instagram? Instagram has Instagram stories. Instagram stories is just, like a slideshow of images and videos. What if you posed the prompt like this? What if you said, what would Juliet's Instagram story look like during Act 2, Scene 2 of Romeo and Juliet? And even give them a little Google Slides template that looks like a phone with Instagram up on it. And then they can just plug images and maybe even videos into it, put some little captions down at the bottom to explain what it is. And all of a sudden we've gotten to the same place. We're just looking at it through a new lens. We're looking at it through the lens of Instagram, Snapchat, of Amazon, of Yelp, of there's all of these different places. And it doesn't just go for apps and, and games and stuff. It goes for anything that kids are into, sports, cooking, fitness, fashion, theater, whatever it is. If we can use the technology to kind of create those experiences like that we just can't in the same way with a piece of paper or a textbook or something, I think that's where we can start to capture that attention and make the most of that technology.
That's really cool. And I'm old school, right? In a former life, I was a journalist and I wrote specifically about education technology. And when I was coming up and doing that, this was right around the time that one-to-one initiatives were really starting to pick up in schools. And I remember a couple of sort of age-old complaints that I think still exist today, or criticisms that still exist today. One of them was the age-old cliche, you can't use technology for technology's sake. And I think you've kind of just addressed that with this idea of create an environment that is familiar. I remember a phrase, and this gets to my other point, which is we used to use a phrase called digital natives. I think in some ways I still hear that phrase used today. The reality is that everybody who is born now is pretty much, including my daughter, who I just mentioned, a digital native. But I think that there are some teachers and educators who quite frankly still aren't, right? There's still that old school mindset. And so how do you as an educator kind of push past what would be that resistance maybe that you might have to technology based on things that you saw years ago that didn't work, or just attitudes that you might have, quite frankly, being a little bit older and coming from a different point in time?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that create that resistance to using technology in some educators. I think for one, sometimes they don't know what the technology is capable of. They look at the laptop and they think of the Microsoft Office suite that they were brought up on, Word and PowerPoint and Excel, and so they think, oh, well, I could have them write it in a document. I understand how that works. I know how documents work. It's text on a page. It looks like, the writing that we would do on a piece of notebook paper. I can see the transition there. Slides. Oh yeah. I could have them do a presentation in front of class and they would just make the slides. And they don't realize, I think sometimes, that even those core tools, like the document, like the slide presentation, can be used in a huge amount of different ways until they start to see some examples of it. And then, of course, we've got a ton of other tools beyond that. We've got all of these web apps that we can use to gamify class and to get quick assessment and to create feedback and help us create teaching materials and all of this stuff. And it's like, if you don't see all of that, if you don't realize what's out there, you have no idea what it's capable of. And a lot of times it's just the matter of picking one thing to find out more about and then just diving in and learning about that thing. You don't have to do all of it. And then I think the second reason that we've gotten resistance on that is that sometimes people are pushing the technology without really thinking about what the goals are. I know so many good teachers that are so good at teaching, and they know what their students need to learn and they know how they need to learn it. And then they have somebody show up and say, hey, your learning management system is going to be part of your evaluation, so you better figure out ways to integrate it. And they're like, why would I do that? But what they haven't had is someone who will sit down with them and say, let's look at what your goals are. What is best for your students? What is best for you to create the instruction that is going to help your students the most? And let's see if this technology can help you do it. And a lot of times there are ways to be able to do it. But what happens is you have, tech people or admins or whoever it is start to try to push instructional technology on teachers without helping them to see how it aligns to their goals, or sometimes without even purchasing technology that does align with their goals. And so then they're shoehorned into using all of this technology where, either they don't see how it fits, or like I was saying earlier, they don't know what it's capable of. I think if we can get over both of those barriers, then there's a ton that we can do.
I saw a statistic, and it's disheartening, and it changes over the years, but the number always seems to go up, not down. And I think the last time I saw it said, on average, school districts have maybe 150 different apps that educators don't use or don't even know exist within sort of their repertoire or their, tech stack, so to speak. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in schools? Is that something that you've seen where there's tech out there that, just to your point, isn't being used because, one, it's not effective, or two, I don't know how to align it with what I'm trying to achieve?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely the reality. You have tons of apps, and then that probably doesn't even count the ones that teachers have signed up for that their admins don't even realize that they're using. So the number is probably even higher than that. And so then what happens with that? You have teachers who are trying to figure those apps out on their own. You have tech integrators or, some sort of tech staff that's trying to be support for 150 different apps, and it's just not possible to do all of that stuff. And then, of course, you got people on the admin level who are trying to figure out how to pay for all of this stuff. And they're looking at it, and maybe they have a handful of users that are really using it, but the vast majority aren't. And they're going, why are we investing all of this money in all of this? And the reality is that a lot of the tools accomplish some of the same goals as some of the other tools, So I'm a huge fan of trying to simplify the entire, instructional technology landscape, but definitely simplify your stack of apps that you use. Like, I'm a big fan, for instance, of Google Slides. Gosh, I've used Google Slides forever, And the nice thing about it is that so many students, even when they're in elementary school, they have some practice with a tool that looks like Google Slides or PowerPoint. And so it's not a steep learning curve, but there's a ton that you can do with it. It's not just for presentation slides. In fact, some of the examples I was talking about earlier, where you can make classroom learning feel like Instagram or Snapchat or Yelp or Amazon, or, like any of those platforms that they use. I've built out templates that look like those websites inside of Google Slides, just so they can go and edit the text and add some images and everything. And all of a sudden it feels like that. I've seen people use it to make comic strips and comic books and entire yearbooks. I've seen them use it to make stop motion animation by duplicating a slide and making a little adjustment to it. I've seen them annotate on images. I've seen them put speech bubbles on images, take snapshots out of the webcam, and then to be able to annotate on top of it. I mean, there's a ton of stuff that you can do just inside of that one thing. But I think what happens a lot of times is well-meaning, tech folks and admin folks want to get more tools, want to put things in the hands of teachers, and they don't look at what are we trying to accomplish with this. And so then the stack just continues to get to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And after a while, everybody's looking around going, I didn't know I had that. Or the leadership is like, why are we paying for this? And a lot of it could be simplified if people would just pay attention to what they're trying to do.
There's that app that I see advertised for sometimes called Rocket Money, I think, and it goes through and it looks at the apps that you're using or not and recommends where you can cut things out. I think maybe school districts could benefit from something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, totally. Hey, I have to ask you because, we talked about this term digital natives and we talk about there's all these apps that people are not using. And then there are the things that students are native to. You talked about things like TikTok, Instagram, things where kids spend their time. And I know there is a little trepidation in schools around bringing some of these apps potentially as they exist into the classroom for fear of some of that stuff that can distract potentially, or access to content that you might not want kids to have in the classroom. So how do you balance the security and sort of, the consistency that you're going for with the want to bring those natural sort of applications that kids use in their everyday lives into the classroom experience?
It's really simple. See, I don't want students to use Instagram and Snapchat to do their work, but I want learning to feel like it instead. And there's a big difference when it comes to those things. See, what happens is a lot of times students get used to using some of these tools. Let's use Instagram as an example. They're going about their daily lives and they're thinking about, in the back of their mind, they're thinking about their Instagram story and they're going, okay, I'm going to go have dinner at this nice place. I'm definitely going to want to take a picture of that and put it in my Instagram story. Oh, and we've got the pep session at the end of school. I'm definitely going to have to get a quick video and put that in there. See, they're already speaking the language of Instagram stories, and it's not a language built out of letters. It's a language built out of images and videos and captions and hashtags. And that's a language. And what I want us to do more of is to create assignments that speak that language instead of specifically use an app. See, there's a line that I put in my Tech Like a Pirate book that I love calling back to because I've used it so much in my own class. You don't need the app to create the experience. And I think once we start to understand that starts to unlock so much stuff. So, let's think about a tool like Yelp. A lot of us have been on Yelp to see, what restaurant we want to go to or hotel we want to go to, if we need to get a plumber or something like that. And so we're familiar with the star ratings and we're familiar with seeing other people's reviews and stuff like that. You don't have to have Yelp to do an activity that starts to feel a little bit like it. And so, I've got, again, another template that I created at some point that looks like a page on Yelp. And what if we did a history lesson where we're looking at the palace at Versailles in France, And so we're doing a review, almost like an Airbnb style review, And let's say one of the reviewers happens to be Napoleon, who was who had to surrender at the palace at Versailles. He's got some baggage when it comes to this place, and that might sneak into his review a little bit. So what if the student gets a hold of this Google Slides template that looks like Yelp, and they're writing it from the perspective of Napoleon. That takes a lot of critical thinking. It takes a lot of deep understanding of the material, and it takes a little bit of creativity too, right? Like, is Napoleon going to be able to put aside his negative experience at the palace at Versailles to write an honest opinion? And we know historically that he loves that place. He loves the way that it looks and everything. Like, there's that tension. And how does the student deal with that? And that's the kind of thing that fits perfectly in Yelp. However, we start to lose their attention if we tell them, get out a sheet of paper and write me a 1-page essay about how Napoleon would have felt about the palace at Versailles. It's like, no, I want to go check my phone now. And maybe maybe they're going and looking at Yelp for restaurants that they're going to go have dinner at that night instead. So it's that idea that you don't need the app to create the experience. I want us creating experiences that feel like the things that students love. And again, like I said earlier, it doesn't just go for the apps that they use. This goes for anything. The more that we understand our students and the more that we understand the things that they love, we can start to craft those learning experiences that feel like the things that students love. And all of a sudden, we have their attention.
Yeah, it's like learning in the context of their lives, right?
Yes.
Which is different, I think, sometimes than the context of our lives. You mentioned this thing. I think it's so interesting. It is almost like learning another language, not a language of words, but a language of experiences. And this notion that I could, as a teacher, unlock a superpower in my ability to reach students by learning this language of experiences is just so powerful to me. If I'm leaning into this, particularly as maybe an educator who's been in the classroom for a while, because I would think that new educators coming in, maybe they have a leg up because they are a bit younger, they're learning things and they're implementing them as they're learning them. But for folks who have been in the classroom for a while and they've always done it a certain way, what do you say to them to kind of get their brain moving in a different direction?
Yeah. And I think I think the answer to this can be really, really easy. They could take something that they already teach, that they're already familiar with. And I would just say, imagine looking at it through the lens of something that students love. How can we make that activity? How can we make that assignment? How can we make that lesson feel a little more like what students love? And in fact, I might even encourage those teachers to find the content or the lesson that they teach that they like the least, or that they have the least good ideas for, and maybe just use this as kind of like a Hail Mary to say, okay, this isn't my best stuff. What could, it can't get probably much worse than what it already is. Let's just give this a shot. And the other side I would give to them on this too is, if you want to make learning feel like things that students love, ask the students. Don't just try to figure this out on your own, because you don't have to. And because if you come at something that students love with very little experience with it, it might make you look inauthentic to them.
Right.
I mean, how many times have students seen adults try to be cool and try to speak their lingo and try to do the things that they do, and all of a sudden the kids are like, oh. Like, whenever you use the word skibbity anymore, it makes every single kid's eyes roll, because it's an adult trying to speak their language and it's inauthentic, right? So what if we just go to them and, maybe try the activity out with like something that they love and say, hey, what did you think about that? Should we do this again in the future? How could we adjust it? And remember, we're trying to use this as a way to show how much you've learned.
Yeah.
And so if we do that, or even if we start at the beginning and say, I want this lesson to feel a little bit like this particular thing. And all of a sudden you got the students' eyes and they're all kind of like looking at each other and like, what? Years ago when I was teaching high school Spanish, I did this with Vine. You remember the social media platform Vine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we recorded little short 6-second video clips about our vocabulary words. And that got my students' attention. And afterwards, it was just like, what do you think about this? How could this be done better? And so, a little bit of trying some things out on your own, but a lot of asking students for their feedback too, I think can really, really make this work.
That's cool, because now the students are also, playing a part in the learning design process, right? They're providing feedback and you're working together to create something. So now it would seem that both the educator and the student has ownership, not only in, the concepts that you're trying to teach, but in the vehicle that you're using to teach. That's a pretty cool idea.
And what you just said there is a key part to attention. See, we started off talking about attention. That's really what all this is about. And the huge part of that, I think, is ownership. It's exactly what you just said, Corey, that if they feel like they own the idea or the idea is theirs or it relates to something to themselves, because what happens so often is we take the curriculum that we're supposed to teach and we tell students, you are going to learn this. This is exactly what you're going to learn. And sometimes we fail to tell them why it's important or relevant or interesting or fun, or maybe we try to and it just doesn't connect. But as soon as they get some skin in the game and they go, okay, we're going to do this, but at least we're going to do it in a way that I've chosen, or at least I've been able to express my preferences in it, then all of a sudden it starts to change the motivation. See, I think a key part of having students' attention in class isn't necessarily about technology. It's about motivation. Are they motivated to do the things that we need them to do or what we want them to do? And there are lots of ways to do it. And one way is to provide that layer of student interest, that layer of connecting it to stuff that they love.
So interest and ownership create motivation, and that ownership and that interest, at least for students, comes by way of these contextual things that they're interested and engaged in. And when they feel like when they feel like they have a voice in how those things are being created, right, in the classroom, then they can start to engage with those things, and teachers can feel more confidently about their delivery, knowing that the kids have already kind of given them their seal of approval. That's pretty cool. I know there's science behind this too. You talk a lot about the link between interactivity and the actual science of learning. So it's not just motivation, but there is a lot to be said for interactivity and actual science. Can you talk to me a little bit about the link there?
Yeah. In fact, I'll point to one particular thing that I think is really relevant here. It's this thing called the reticular activating system. It's a part of your brain that functions almost like the brain's bodyguard. Because if you think about it, if your brain tried to process all of the stimulus that was coming to it through all of its senses all the time, it would just short circuit. Yeah. So it has to come up with a filter, a way to be able to block out some of the things that are not important or not relevant. And so the reticular activating system is like the brain's bodyguard. And if it feels like what someone is saying or doing is irrelevant or unimportant, it's likely to filter it out. And I know lots of us that are teachers have felt filtered out by our students' reticular activating systems. But when we start to connect what students are learning to the things that they love, whether it's apps or games or sports or shows or music or, whatever it is that they're interested in, all of a sudden it starts to matter, and the reticular activating system starts to let it through. And so there's even like a brain science link between connecting things that students love to the learning to kind of like open up those attention floodgates.
So those pathways in the brain are opened up. There is some science behind this. I'm a teacher, I'm leaning into this thing. I'm saying, all right, I have struggled with this notion of how to integrate technology in my classroom in an effective and efficient way. I've hated that it's felt pushed down on me. But what you're saying is, hey, let's open it up to the students. Let's see what they want to do. Let's include them in the process, and then let's create things that are contextually relevant for them. Where should I start if I'm an educator and I'm thinking, Matt, this sounds awesome. I want to do this. I want to do a better job of this. I think it is the missing ingredient for me. Where do I begin?
Okay, I got two places where I suggest that you start. One has to do with the technology, one has to do with the students. So the first one that has to do with the technology is to pick an app or pick a feature inside of an app that you could use in the classroom that you think has potential, that you think could be engaging to students, that you think in some way could create the learning environment, create the conditions that you want to have for optimal learning, for student engagement, for whatever it is that you're trying to do. Kind of get your eyes open, talk to other people and figure out what you think has a chance, and then go learn that one little piece of it and see if it's a good fit. See, I think a lot of times the overwhelm happens when we don't know where to start. It's not a problem of having too many options. It's just not knowing where to start. So pick a spot and learn a little more about that technology, and that might be the big starting point for you. The second one has to do with the students. And the advice here is just listen. Listen to what they talk about. I found out about Vine when the freshmen in my Spanish 1 class before class were all huddled around somebody's phone watching it, and we're all curious about it. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, oh no, we're in trouble. And I'm like, no, I just want to know what you're doing. I just want to see. I'm curious too. What is it that has you guys so interested? And then they showed it to me. And so I think whenever you listen in class, you got to do supervision in the hallways like I do in high school a lot of times. Listen to what kids are talking about. Ask them questions. Ask them about things. Be genuinely curious about your students. And then when you find out what they're kind of into, what they're interested in, then you start to ask, how could that fit in a lesson? How could I fit that? I think the kids would tell us that that's how adults ruin everything. But sometimes it works, right? Especially if we talk to them about ways that it feels natural and it feels like an interesting fit.
Very cool. Now, I know later this fall, you're pulling a group together to talk about how to use technology in this way, right? Creating a buzzworthy classroom that you said that captures students' attention and actually holds it. Tell me a little bit about this group, what you'll be talking about. I'm sure there's some folks listening who might want to participate.
Yeah, this is exactly what we're going to be talking about in this cohort. So we're going to be talking about some very practical ways that you can teach in this way that captures students' attention and plays on their interest. We're going to talk about places that you can get ideas so that you know what it is that students are interested in and some new ideas that you can infuse in. We're going to talk about the concept of attention and how to capture students' attention and how to fold all of this stuff together in meaningful ways in the classroom, no matter what it is that you teach. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And this is the exact same kind of stuff that I've been leading workshops in schools and school districts all around the United States for the last 5 years or so. And this is the kind of stuff where after we're done, I hear back from folks that say, like the school leadership, and they'll say, oh, I walked down the hallway and I saw several teachers that were already using these ideas in class. And, this is the stuff, it's the kind of thing also, I think, that if you're a teacher and you're starting to feel sort of like the drag of, not being super inspired by the things that are happening in your classroom, this is the kind of thing that I think can inject some life into your veins and remind you what you're excited about teaching again. And yeah, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. It's something that's come right out of my own classroom. And, anybody that wants to join, I know you'll come away with practical ideas and, maybe a new inspiration for teaching that you've just been craving for a long time.
Oh, I love it. I think that's probably a great place to wrap this conversation. Matt, I want to say thank you. This is Matt Miller, author of Ditch That Textbook and Tech Like a Pirate. Matt, it's been great to have you. For folks that are interested in the cohort that Matt is leading later this fall, if you're watching on YouTube, I will drop the link down below. If you're listening on Spotify or Amazon or wherever you get your favorite pods, the easiest thing to do is just go to www.rocketpd.com and click on that button right there on the front page where you can look at our 2025 cohorts and you can join Matt there. Matt, again, I just want to say thank you. This has been a great conversation, one that I love because, again, I was a reporter for a long time and I wrote about education technology. I love following the way things are changing. I love the work that you're doing. I just want to say thank you again, and hopefully we'll have you back on the show again real soon.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I appreciate it.
You got it, Matt. Take care. Thanks for listening to this episode of the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the RocketPD Podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for RocketPD. At RocketPD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at rocketpd.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.